So we're now in the panel session. This is going just fine. And so I have questions if people can't think of anything to say. But what I would really like is if the speakers today would start commenting on this issue and the other things that that they observed during the afternoon session, and to feel free to direct questions towards other speakers as well. And you were going to make a comment?
Yeah. I was going to ask Mr. Venture Capitalist, what's the exit strategy for being in love with a baby?
I'm not sure what all the conversations about babies have been recently. Maybe it's because I'm turning 35, you will. I don't like. I'm glad you bring that up. As a venture capitalist, I hate thinking about exit strategies. Hopefully my investors are not going to look this up on the internet. But we look at building businesses that are just going to be great continuously. So.
I enjoyed all the speakers. Thank you so much. It was highly informative, and it was interesting to go from the different sessions to a session that started and ended with business. And when we think of transhumanism and Humanity Plus, we don't necessarily think strictly about business and building a corporation or building an organization. But the various components of putting together this structure are vastly important. Sure, the technology is great, being scientifically aware is great, but we've got to know the basic fundamentals of building an organization or a corporate or non-corporate structure. And that's why I valued the talks, John and Max, your talks on this particular project. Now, what I'd like to know and what I thought was missing from both of your talks, and I think would be very valuable for the audience, is could you please explain how your talks relate to transhumanism? And the caveat here is because I was asked by numerous people during the break, how can we expand the transhumanist movement? How can we get more people involved, and what is our message? And I think we need to look at it strategically from a business perspective. Thank you.
Okay, well, I think I did address that to some extent in my talk. I'll try to show some parallels between organizations and future minds and the kind of minds we may build with AI. And it's interesting how to apply those principles both ways. But I think another aspect is that one small aspect of my talk was that what we call best practices in business typically are not necessarily very effective practices. They're what everybody else is doing in the industry or what leading people are doing or what top academics say we should be doing. But the standard of actual kind of scientific knowledge in business is extremely low, and that's partly because it's simply a very complex area, a lot of complex phenomena involving people, and any of the social sciences involving people are also fairly soft sciences, even economics, which likes to pretend otherwise. So it's naturally going to be difficult, but there is some real knowledge out there in business. There's knowledge about critical thinking, knowledge about better ways of making decisions, of creating strategy, of doing critical and creative thinking, of communication. Some things are tested and others are not. Some management theories and some ways of organizing people and managing people are better tested than others. And I just find it remarkable that we're not using this kind of intelligence that we have and not even testing these principles better to build better organizations. And I think as transhumanists, we like to be far-sighted and to pride ourselves on seeing further into the future of technology. It would also be good for us to apply some of that attention, not all of us, but not all the time, to looking at what do we really know about managing and creating organizations. Especially, I think, for venture capitalists, that would be a great idea to actually look at that knowledge, because then you could apply it to startups and see whether they're doing any of the stuff that's proven to work, or if they're doing an interesting experiment, which obviously is going to fail many times. So I think, partly the direct parallels I made, but I'd also say that we could maybe have an advantage in some of these businesses involving advanced technology, whether it's applications of the Gada Prize, whether it's AGI, by applying the most advanced knowledge on both critical creative ends to our ventures.
I guess I would just add that from my perspective, it may not be the only way, but it is certainly a powerful way to ensure sustainability over the long term if you can figure out ways to create viable businesses around this technology and the exploration that's occurring. So I think that that's a key question that ought to be on the minds of everyone, rather than just waiting for another donor or another contributor to help advance the cause? How can we create businesses? I think the business mindset favors very much a staging approach, which rapid iteration of learning, which I think is a powerful element to drive learning and exploration. I think part of at least the research we've been doing is how do you go beyond the notion of single enterprises and create networks of participants who are jointly pursuing a particular performance improvement objective and learn from each other, as well as pursue profit-making activity as individual entities. I think that's an area that's just beginning to be really understood and that can really help to drive a lot of the transhumanist agenda. So it's not just an individual company making a fortune, it's how do you create a broader ecosystem of companies that are learning from each other and advancing the knowledge in the process.
If you're interested in organizational innovation, there's a very interesting talk by Ricardo Semler. He gave it at Sloan School of Management at MIT. You can find it on the web by Googling it. He's the CEO of Semco, a Brazilian company that's grown by about 25% a year for the last 27 years. He advocates and practices democratic management where employees get to decide on things. He boasts he hasn't made a decision in the last, I think, 10 years or more. And clearly it's worked. People choose their own bosses. People can... Actually, why not? So, how is the chairman? I mean, how is the chairman of the next, Humanity Plus going to be chosen? I mean, from what I recollect, that I remember some board meetings happening at the last party, which were like 4 people huddled around, after drinking some. I mean, maybe it can be open to everybody here and everybody out there on the web. So no, I think these ideas are very powerful. It can be applied to more than just a company. There's more ideas there. I mean, letting people contribute no matter where they are. At Abinventio, we work with people in Kyrgyzstan. We work with people who work for other companies. Full-time people, part-time people, and that allows you to thrive. Even with very few resources initially. So I think there's a lot of interesting ideas there, and he has a couple of books out there too.
So I think if you want to be successful, you copy the methods of the most successful people who've achieved the most in the shortest amount of times. And I would love to have more discussion about this. Let's copying the methods of democracy, because I think democratic large governments have been the most horrible things you could possibly copy. They've achieved the most bad in the most amount of time. As opposed to all forms of organization. I think that the forms of organization that have achieved the most in the shortest amount of time are technology startup companies. And if you look at what Google's achieved, you look at what Facebook has achieved, and if you look at what I hope SpaceX will achieve, actually, if you just look at what it's done so far, which is the first private company to reach orbit, and this week, potentially the first private company to re-enter after making orbit. You can check that out on the December 7th. We're going to be launching and then re-entering a Dragon capsule. You can actually, if you build the organization the right way, if it's a mission-focused organization, the people that are founding the company are not doing it primarily for money, you can achieve astounding things in a short amount of time, and that's what I want to keep doing.
Which looks at how organizations are created today based upon game theory, Cold War, self-interest, etc. And most of the organizations we have today are built on that. And then now there are a lot of technologies using video games and using games to look at how do you bring people together to share knowledge. So things like open spaces, World Cafe, and a lot of these kind of things. And we're really looking at how do you take these kind of processes, which are kind of role-playing, 6 hats, these kind of things, and use interactive media, video game technologies to help organizations mine their talent and share in an open way.
I'm somewhat of an outsider here. This is my first H+ conference, and so I haven't drank the Kool-Aid yet. But when I go home tomorrow and somebody says, "What's transhumanism?" I don't think that I will have an elevator speech to tell them what it is. And even after being here for the 2 days, it's not a deep, concise concept crystallized in my mind, at least. And maybe there's you have an elevator. Okay, but I think for an organization to thrive as a movement, if you look at MoveOn.org, they had a very targeted thing. Everybody write their congressman and do this thing. Bam, it's done. If you look at Alcoholics Anonymous, which I think is one of the most successful viral organizations, it's about sobriety. And they have a very well-defined, crystallized vision. And maybe you all have it and I just haven't seen it yet. But I think crystallizing that and giving somebody an activity to follow up on, I call it the summer camp syndrome. Everybody meets and has a nice, warm experience at the conference, but then they go home and they lose the energy. So having activities and things that people can act on, move on, click here for that, I think helps drive the movement.
If I can comment on Lou's comment on democracy, I think the reason why large democratic governments have been not very effective is because they're large, not because they're democratic. So large autocratic governments haven't gotten any farther. So I would distinguish between, I agree. What's that? Who? It depends on how you evaluate it, right? And China is one. Well, I mean, poverty is just one of the human miseries, or one of the sources of human misery. There's lots of others. As the people in jail, whether they're happy, but it's not. I mean, China is one example. There's lots of other for every China. There's lots of. I come from Argentina, where a dictatorship led to lots and lots of murdered people and no real economic prosperity, or at least not enough of it to justify it. So yeah, I mean, small organizations are great. I mean, go to Margaret Mead for if you want to achieve something, get a committed group of small people. But it's not against, it's not something against democracy. I think it's about the size of organizations.
Oh, thank you. So one of the things that I hear a lot in the technology community is that small companies are really effective at making change. That's potentially a problem because a lot of the problems that I want solved are really big problems that 30 people crammed into one building can solve. So can you maybe talk about like some large organizations and what are large organizations doing that we as a society might want to emulate to create larger organizations that are more effective for solving large problems? Any ideas on that?
They're creating smaller groups. I mean, look at, every successful product that Google launched was not a Google-wide initiative, right? It's a small team, focused on that. I'd say if you're a big organization and you want to create, large change, create lots of small teams and give them lots of vested interest on team members to get that team's mission to succeed.
How can the rest of the world out, let's say, social groups, groups of friends, like other types of organisms other than commercial entities, how can they emulate that behavior to be more effective and change the world?
I think, again, create small groups with a very focused, crisp mission, right? At QLS, we have, everybody knows what the mission of the company is. It's to eliminate standing in line from the face of the earth. And so, every decision is judged in the face of that, does it help that or does it not?
To join that to the previous comment from Tom, I think there's an interesting question here that there's an interesting distinction, I think, an important distinction between the definition of transhumanism, which to me is perfectly clear, but I can understand why you wouldn't get that from this conference because nobody really talked about transhumanism as such at this conference. We've kind of done that so many times, we're focusing on more specific areas, so I can see why you could get through this and still not be too clear what it was, but I'll be happy to give you a good, clear definition. But the question of what Humanity Plus should focus on, it is very important that organizations that are successful do tend to have a very specific focus. They know exactly what they're doing. And I think that's a real challenge for Humanity Plus because it doesn't have a narrow focus. It has a very broad agenda. We're trying to promote transhumanism as a whole. And that's a real challenge. And I've only very recently joined the board, but we've already been discussing this. We've been trying to figure out how do we take this very broad agenda and get lots of specific things done. And I think what we've just been saying here, most of us on the same wavelength, probably what we need to do is to start, once we've got a very clear vision, then start breaking that down into some specifics, and then putting people in charge or small groups in charge in a structured way where they interact and get support from resources such as they are, and let them run with that. And the Guided Prize is a good example of that. That's something we brought in recently. Brian's pretty much in charge of that, and we're not micromanaging him on that. And I think that's the way we have to go, to maintain this broad agenda, but divide it into clear sub-goals, and then set people on that, and figure out how to do that more effectively.
If I can add just one sentence to limit or sort of my previous comments to make sure they're not overgeneralized. I do think democracy can be improved upon dramatically, right? So you can weigh people's sort of votes based on their reputation and their knowledge of something. So I think we have a long way to go to get group-based decisions to be better. But I think a group is typically, more brains are typically better than one. And I bet you, I mean, that if the next conference, was picked by, the speakers were picked by the whole group, weighed in some way, it doesn't need to be everybody equal, rather than one person, it's going to be an even better conference than this time. I mean, just personal bet and suggestion.
Can I just ask, I mean, there are examples, I think, that are not directly analogous, but perhaps have some interesting insight. How many of you have heard of a company called Portal Player? Ooh. How many of you have heard of the iPod? Portal Player was a critical player in the development of the iPod. It turns out it was a startup that was created, I think, back in 2000 or maybe 1999. I'm not sure the exact dates, but it was created several years before the iPod ever came to market. And it basically was driven, it was a startup in Silicon Valley. It was driven by the notion of this emerging category of personal digital music players. It realized at the time there were huge technology challenges in terms of making this a viable product category, everything from the miniaturization to power management to quality of the music to the price point. And what they did was they brought together a global network of technology players. They went out and consciously went to identify who are the best-in-class technology players in all of the different components that have to come together in a digital music player. And every 6 months, they had a discipline of releasing a new digital music player platform. And every 6 months, they made a choice as to who would get incorporated into that platform and who would not. But because there was another one 6 months later, there was still hope for those who were left out that they could participate in the next wave. And so they drove very rapid innovation around this emerging product category through this global network of participants. And just to fill out the story, because I think it's a constant pet peeve of mine that the mythology around around the iPod is one day Steve Jobs, in the brilliance of his office, came up with this incredible breakthrough innovation, and everything else is history. The other part of the story is that a guy who was at Philips Electronics actually came up with the idea to combine a digital music player with an online music service. He pitched the idea to Philips Electronics management. They turned it down. He was so passionate about it, he quit his job immediately, and he started walking up and down the streets of Silicon Valley. One day he had the good fortune of meeting Steve Jobs, and Steve Jobs, to his credit, had the brilliance to recognize a great idea when he saw it. He hired the guy on the spot. He said, "You have 9 months to introduce the first iPod." This guy realized he couldn't do it in 9 months, but he remembered he had met with Portal Player. He called, his first phone call when he was hired was to Portal Player. Portal Player delivered the entire product other than the skin and the user interface. Everything else was Portal Player. That's the story, and I think that model of how do you create networks that are driven by very tangible performance objectives and through rapid iterations and learning together actually creates enormous progress, and I certainly encourage that model. And I mentioned that China and India are actually way ahead of us in all of this, and they are doing extraordinary things. There are a whole set of companies that I can point to in China that are driving very interesting business innovation through this network approach.
A lot of us are very familiar with startup companies in Silicon Valley and California. Can you tell me something interesting from an anecdote from an Indian or Chinese company of the behavior that I wouldn't see in California but I would see over there?
The behaviors in China and India are around scalability of these networks, of business networks that are being created. So they, in one case, in the apparel industry, there's a company called Li & Fung. I don't know how many of you know Li & Fung. 10,000 business partners around the world, operating in very tight integration, tight coordination of supply network products for the activities for the apparel industry. But they have mastered a modular, loosely coupled approach to process management that is something well beyond the capacity of most Western companies. In fact, the company that's known as the master of supply chain management in the United States, Walmart, announced 6 months ago that they were turning over all their apparel sourcing activities to Li & Fung because they couldn't replicate the kind of loosely coupled modular approach that Li & Fung had developed. 10,000 business partners. I think that's a scalability that we have very limited capacity to even understand, much less replicate. So.
Plus, it's the trust. Just a lot of close families.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about Li & Fung is they're built on trust-based relationships. They have 10,000 business partners. They have deep trust-based relationships with all of them. We've gone out and interviewed a lot of their partners, so this is not just press releases. This is actual discussions with the partners. The focus they have on that, and at the same time creating this kind of flexibility around modular approaches where you can quickly bring in a partner or pull out a partner as needed. One of the interesting examples with Li & Fung was in the aftermath of the terrorist attack in 2001, 9/11. Li & Fung had a lot of its apparel production activity in Pakistan. You didn't want to be depending on time-sensitive production activity in Pakistan at that particular point in time. Within 3 weeks, they had moved out all their production activity from partners in Pakistan to partners in more secure parts of the world, something, again, a Western company could never have replicated. So it's that degree of flexibility, the modularity, that I think is very interesting. There's a whole set of stories around the motorcycle industry where there's a set of Chinese entrepreneurial network-based companies that are beating the pants off the Japanese who have tightly integrated architectures, tightly integrated business processes, and the Chinese have basically modularized everything. So.
Sure. Tom, you mentioned in your talk your history in the past with network solutions, and I wondered if you had any comment on the recent trend of seizing domain names for places that are putting out unpopular information, because I think this whole movement has a fair amount of exposure to that.
I don't have any particular response to it. This is 10 years ago that I was active in that. I guess I don't fully understand your question. Does somebody else want to respond? Or? Well, I was going to say, there's a movement out there. There's a guy, I think his name's Peter Sunderland, who's trying to come up with a distributed DNS. And basically, you understand you can work that gives them a problem. Right.
So in the wake of the recent WikiLeaks scandal, there's been a lot of censorship effort. They got booted off Amazon's service. PayPal banned their founding, every DNS, banned their domain name system. So they used to disseminate a list of 208 mirrors where their content is. Many of them are only IP addresses, so not vulnerable to DNS. They have servers in Switzerland, Netherlands. I don't think they have anything more in Sweden, because that's where Julian Assange was accused of some sexual allegation. So the model would be to be extremely distributed, and there is indeed an initiative to have a peer-to-peer DNS distributed via torrent files.
And so we're coming to the end of our time with the panel, and so I'm going to use the moderator's privilege to add my comments to these recent questions in light of the talks we heard today. I think that one of the biggest challenges that humanity faces is that, being constrained to walled gardens. One of the things about the internet that really inspired me was how open it was and how anyone could create an entity and put it and make it real. I've become very concerned about Facebook and all these other services where people are building things inside of walled gardens where you're subject to it being removed by the people who control DNS, or I've had groups that were shut down by Facebook and never allowed to reopen. And I think that in business practice and in economics, we need to think about how we make our systems more resilient to people trying to shut them down. And so with that, we've run out of time. And I'd like to thank all of our panelists.